I want to talk to you about Ukraine. I won't criticize Joe Biden visiting Ukraine other than to say it could have happened sooner when other world leaders were going there. But he finally went. And I think it is a good thing when the president of the United States, and he is our president, whether you like him or not, he showed up in Kyiv to encourage them and boost their morale. I support the war effort in Ukraine. There's a conservative host who will go nameless who was on a podcast claiming how Americans want his son to go fight and die in the fields of Ukraine against the Russians. That's blitheringly insane nonsense. The whole reason I support the Ukraine war effort is because I don't want our sons and daughters to fight the Russians. When I was a kid, there was a thing. It was the phrase was coined by Winston Churchill in a speech in Missouri, an iron curtain descending across Europe. There was a divide between Eastern and Western Europe. The territories the Soviets had invaded and recaptured from the Nazis were under Soviet control. And a lot of countries existed in name, but were behind the scenes run by the Soviets. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, at the time Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia. And then, of course, there were the Russian territories that were part of the USSR. Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were part of the USSR for a time. Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan. These were all parts of the Soviet state. Tajikistan. And the Soviet Union was a ruthless regime. It was an atheist regime. It was a horrible place to live. There are a lot of people who want to revise the Soviet Union, Bernie Sanders being included among them, who tend to claim it wasn't that bad. Bernie Sanders took his honeymoon to the Soviet Union. He was a propagandist and apologist for the Soviets. Bernie Sanders claimed it was a good thing that there were bread lines because at least people weren't going hungry, which is nonsense. There were lots of people who were starving in the Soviet Union. There were bread lines because they had no plenty in the Soviet Union. Soviets who would come to the United States or Western Europe and see Western grocery stores were amazed. The Soviet Union maintained a sphere of influence into Eastern Europe, and it was one that for a time the Russian Empire had also had. The Russian Empire had spheres of influence. Crimea in Ukraine used to be a hard-fought, hard-won territory of the Russian Empire. Ukraine itself was essentially the slave state of the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union. They were their own people with their own identity. And the Russians and then the Soviets ruthlessly tried to stamp out that identity, and the Ukrainian identity remained. The Ukrainian language prevailed. For so long, we in the West said Kiev, and that was the Russian pronunciation for the capital of Ukraine. The Ukrainians said Kyiv, and much of the West has gone back to saying Kyiv in recognition of Ukrainian sovereignty. The reason I have supported the war in Ukraine and the war effort there is because at some point, if the Russians are emboldened in Ukraine, they're going to be emboldened to spread further across the former Soviet sphere, the former Russian Empire sphere. They're going to be emboldened to try to take back and control through force or through subversion territories. There's a report out today, in fact, that the Russians have plans to take over Belarus. Belarus has been a client state of Vladimir Putin's. Belarus is run by a strong man who is there and allowed to be there because of Vladimir Putin. And the Russians want to thoroughly reintegrate it into Russia. They want to thoroughly reintegrate Ukraine into Russia. They would like to thoroughly integrate Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania back into Russia. And if you know Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, these are proud countries. In fact, much of the territory controlled by Russia in the east all the way to Moscow used to be part of the Kingdom of Lithuania, which receded over time. The Lithuanians are a very proud and wonderful people. Estonia is probably the most free market country on planet Earth. Latvia as well. Strongly free market. These people had a very hard time fleeing the Nazis. I know multiple people who had to flee Latvia because of the Nazis, and then the Soviets took over and they could not go home. These were proud nations. Poland, of course, has a terrible, sad history of being conquered and broken up by surrounding neighbors from Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Russia itself. And the Poles now stand free and for freedom, and the Russians ruthlessly covet integrating themselves back into Poland and into Hungary and into Romania, into Moldova. The Russians may be launching a coup in Moldova right now. The Russians want a major sphere of influence, and these nations are our allies and our friends. These nations rejected the Soviets and embraced Western democracy and American values. These nations looked to the Statue of Liberty, they looked to Ronald Reagan, and they hoisted the American flag in their rebellions against Soviet communist control. And we should stand with them because they don't want to be us, they want to be with us. They do not want to immigrate to us, they just want our values there. They want our freedom, they want the free market, they want the American flag as a symbol of freedom and liberty, and we should encourage countries that want that to be able to stand up on their own. And the Russians are threatened by that. For a long time, there was a theory prevalent on the right that the Russians should be integrated into the West. Vladimir Putin chose not to be. There is a level of revisionist history on the right, no better than the revisionist histories of Nicole Hannah-Jones and Ibram Kendi on the left, that comes to, well, we overstretched NATO. We tried to offer Ukraine into NATO, and that threatened the Russians, and we're to blame for the Russians. The Blame America First crowd should die on the ash heap of history. And yet it has now reared its head on the right. The idea that we considered expanding NATO to Ukraine, which we rejected, by the way, should not be the provocation for the Russians going into Ukraine, because we rejected the idea of Ukraine joining NATO and are only now reconsidering it because of this war. Moscow wants a sphere of influence, and the problem is we are allies with a number of the countries into which Moscow wants its sphere of influence. And I agree with the thinking of many that if they are emboldened and can take Ukraine, they will start moving into other territories, and eventually it will come to conflict with us. And I would rather fund the Ukrainians and let the Ukrainians kill the Russians than let your sons and my son be the ones who have to go stop the Russians. I would rather fund a proxy war. It's what we did in the Cold War. Around the world, Ronald Reagan funded proxy wars with the Soviet Union, and we stopped Soviet incursions into our spheres of influence. It was good then, it's good now. It is a good tactic. It's a good strategy. It keeps our sons and daughters from dying. Your sons and daughters will eventually go to war with Russia if we don't stop Russia now. And if we don't stop Russia now, we will go to war with Russia and China together, and they will be formidable. Funding Ukraine is about us not going to war. And the people on the right who say, oh, we're going to go to war with Russia, are totally missing the ball on this, because they're trying to scare you out of funding Ukraine, in large part because of their isolationist tendencies. And as a student of history, I look at us isolated, and every time the United States isolates itself, the world goes to war. The world does not go to war when the United States stands astride the nation, the globe, saying we are the leader of the free world. The world does not go to war when the United States exercises its authority as the last best hope of mankind. But I have to tell you something. I'm getting a little damn tired of the people who support Ukraine saying, if you don't, you're a tool of the Russians. If you don't, you support China. If you don't, you support the Russians. We have to give them blank checks. Why the hell do we have to give Ukraine a blank check? I support funding the war in Ukraine. But the idea that you can't write a blank check to the people of East Palestine, Ohio, but you can to Ukraine is kind of crap. The idea that we have to give Ukraine everything it wants, but we can't give the people of East Palestine, Ohio, what they want is kind of nonsense. The idea that we have to fund the pensions of the Ukrainians and we can't actually fund Social Security in this country, we just borrow from it until it goes bankrupt, is kind of nonsense. I think we should help Ukraine, but that help should come with a cost-benefit analysis. That help should come with some restraint. We should not be writing blank checks. And the people out there who are the teetotalers on this, who are like, you either support them and give them everything they want or you're with the Russians, that's not helpful. That actually undermines your case, because that suggests a level of ideology as opposed to a level of reason. That suggests a level of cult-like behavior and not a call to arms to defend Ukraine and actually prevent us from having to go into a direct war with Russia. I think we should be there. I think we should be giving them their arms. I think we should be giving them money that they can buy our weapons, creating jobs in Alabama at the weapons manufacturers. But the idea we give them a blank check, the idea that Ron DeSantis coming out yesterday saying we can't be writing blank checks is somehow anathema to the war effort is kind of nuts. We can't write blank checks to a foreign country. But I think we should support them if we can, and we should. This all-in or all-out stuff is just driving me crazy on both sides. There's got to be some nuance to the conversation. There's got to be some restraint in the conversation. I think it is in our national interests to help the Ukrainians kill these Russian soldiers who have invaded their country. After all, Russia invaded Ukraine, but it's also deeply unhelpful to have Ukrainian ministers saying, we're going to drive our tanks that we've just given them to Red Square. That's not helpful either. They undermine their own side. Where is the restraint at this point? It makes a lot of sense to me from a national security perspective to be doing what we're doing. And you know what we found out? The weapons we built during the Cold War to stop the Soviets and then to restrain the Russians, they actually work really freaking good. I said freaking. They work great. They do what we designed them to do. In the real world tests, we've deployed them in Ukraine, and they're masterful. They are head and shoulders above what the Russians have offered, something that we theorized but did not know, and now we know. And now we can refine those weapon systems, and we even get to test them against the Chinese weapon systems that are slowly going into Ukraine. We get to use Ukraine as an experimental battlefield for our next generation of technology. That's a good thing. When we were fighting ISIS in the mountains of Kraplakistan, we didn't need these weapons. Now we do, and they work beautifully. But we can't write blank checks. And we shouldn't insult the people who disagree with us. We should restrain the hysterical nonsense about our sons dying in the fields of Ukraine, which isn't true. But we should also recognize people do have reservations about all the money we're sending to Ukraine, particularly when Joe Biden doesn't want to send money to East Palestine, Ohio, dealing with the rail disaster. We got to recognize those things. But I wish those who are opposed to helping Ukraine would see the larger picture here. The Russians and the Chinese are beginning to build a relationship to rival us. Us using Ukraine as a proxy to whittle down and harm the Russians who want to harm us is actually a smart play for our national security. It's also really, really likely that if we don't restrain Vladimir Putin there, he will eventually begin to encroach upon the territories of our allies, whether surreptitiously through rigging elections or through military attack. And either way, we're going to have to confront the threat if we don't confront it in Ukraine. This is not something that's going away. And I would rather not have your son and my son and your daughter and my daughter fighting the Russians when the Ukrainians are very willing to fight them for us.